Welcome to the recorded version of Supporting Families Through Hospice and Palliative Care, part of the Family Caregiver Support webinar series brought to you by the American Society on Aging and a generous sponsorship from Home Instead Senior Care.
Okay, our speaker today is going to be Molly Carpenter. Author, speaker, trainer, and family caregiver, Molly Carpenter brings years of personal and professional senior care experience and training to families dealing with dementia care. In her current role, Molly works with a team responsible for ensuring that the Home Instead Senior Care Network's 60,000 caregivers worldwide have the resources necessary to effectively provide quality care in the home and understand the importance of their work enhancing the lives of those that they serve. Molly holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Family Science with a gerontology specialization from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a master's degree in education with a gerontology specialization from the University of Nebraska-Omaha. And with that, I'd like to welcome our presenter for the day, Molly Carpenter. Thanks for being here, Molly.
Thank you, Steve, and thank all of you. I just want to thank all of you so much for being here today for this webinar. I know in some cases it's over the lunch hour, and I don't know about you, but in my neck of the woods it's a beautiful sunny day, and sometimes during the summer it's hard to be on these calls and these webinars, but I appreciate you being here. This is such a great topic. I know it sounds morbid to talk about hospice is great, but I think a lot of us and a lot of you on the phone today probably have had some experience with this and know a lot about hospice, and so you know what I mean when I say that's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful service that we offer in our healthcare system, and so I'm really excited. I'm always excited to talk about this topic today. So unfortunately, like I said, it can be a little bit morbid of a topic, and we know that families, as we talk about our family caregivers, they don't look forward to this time at all. But then the thing about hospice is that this really can provide some of that relief from the physical and emotional strains and some of that psychological stress. So it's really just a beautiful thing. And, our job as professionals, that's where we can help them navigate this journey of end of life for their loved ones. You all, I say this a lot, but you guys all have such a big responsibility in your daily job, and that is educating. I bet you're educating and telling people things. That's probably what the most of your days are spent doing. And when it comes to the end-of-life discussion, it's really an emotionally charged confirmation. So all that information that you're providing is so crucial. And so as we go through the information today, I know you're going to be familiar with things, and I know you're going to know pretty much the ins and outs. But the reason we review that again is because when I put these together, I take a look at it from a family caregiver perspective. So hopefully you can gain a couple of little nuggets or even a little bit of new information that's going to help you explain things to families even better, help families, ease into this situation and ease into the end-of-life discussion. So I think one of the biggest things is really explaining the difference between the two unique care plans, which is hospice and palliative care. So I think that's probably one of the toughest things when I'm talking to families to explain. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. But before we get into the content and the objectives, I want to say that at Home Instead Senior Care, just so you understand where the content has come from, we did partner with the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association to develop a training for our professional caregivers and our family caregivers. So all of this content today is from our sessions and our training that we give to families as well as our caregivers. So let's look at the objectives on the next slide, just so you can see what we're going to talk about today. And like I mentioned, we want to explain the difference between hospice and palliative care. We also want to understand the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual changes that can occur. We are going to talk about the hospice team and look at everybody's role. And then, of course, throughout this webinar and even at the end, we will talk about resources, and we're going to talk about ways that family caregivers can take better care of themselves through this situation. When end of life is happening, families are so worried about, I don't want to leave mom or dad's side, and they don't want to leave. They just always want to be around, and so it's very crucial to talk about family caregivers better taking care of themselves. So let's look at the next slide and start with what is hospice, and let's start talking about the difference between hospice and palliative care. Now, I think hospice, to me anyway, I don't know about all of you, and maybe it's just because we're in this industry, but I feel like the topic is getting more and more sort of the limelight or discussion, or it's out in the world a little bit more than it used to. So it's hard for me to gauge because I run into families that they've never heard the word before. But then I run into a lot of people that know what hospice is. But what hospice, I think the biggest point that I always like to make to families is that it neither hastens nor postpones death. So we're not trying to speed up death, but we're not trying to postpone it, is how I say it very bluntly to families in a very nice way. And really, it's the concept of care. It affirms life, and it faces dying as a normal part of living. So when you talk to families about hospice, this isn't about, we're on hospice, we're trying to speed things up. No. We're trying to affirm the person's life, and we're just trying to deal with this situation as a part of living. And as a lot of you know, I know you all know, that hospice it's a holistic approach. And I think I explain that a lot to families, too, that the family and the person on hospice are at the center. And there's unique care plans for both the family and the person on hospice, which I think is a very unique part of this program. And that primary caregiver is very, very involved, and they're at the heart of this team or this illness as well. Now, hospice care focuses on helping to improve the quality of life, and it helps the individual live with dignity during the time that is left. I use those words a lot, live with dignity. And the goal is really to help the person complete life's journey with comfort and dignity and companionship. Now, one of the biggest things about hospice is that it does manage symptoms. Relief and comfort are the goals when there's no cure for the illness that the person's facing. Now, we do know that statistics show us that 80% of hospice care is provided in the patient's home. It could be in a family member's home, though, as well. It could be in nursing homes. Inpatient hospice facilities are also sometimes available to assist with caregiving. And even though the family caregiver is typically the main, quote, hospice provider, there is that team of professionals that we're going to talk about in a little bit later. Now, in conjunction with hospice, the term palliative care is often used, and some may use this term interchangeably, but they're not the same. So let's look on the next slide more about palliative care and the difference between hospice and palliative care. Now, palliative care can best be described as pain relieving or comfort care. People of any age can receive palliative care for a serious illness, whether it's life-threatening, whether it's a chronic condition, or life-limiting illness. And the goal of palliative care is to improve symptoms, which then relieves the pain or the stress from the condition that they have or from the life-threatening illness or whatever it may be. Now, it has a lot of the same focus areas as hospice, as you can see on the slide. But the last bullet on that slide, no longer receiving curative treatment, that is the main difference between hospice and palliative care. So you can get palliative care, so a person can receive palliative care when they're on chemo or radiation, for example. Another difference about palliative care is that Medicare at this time does not cover the cost of palliative care. A lot of times I use a story to illustrate this to families because when I first learned about hospice and palliative care, it really was a learning curve for me to really understand the differences between the two. And of course, I studied it a lot closer than what we're going to tell families, but it really took a little bit for that moment to click. And so I sometimes tell a story about my own grandmother, and I talk about how when she was had some issues and she went into the doctor and they said, we think it's your gallbladder, and so we're going to go in and take your gallbladder out. But when they took her into surgery, they found cancer in her gallbladder and her stomach, kind of quite a few places. And so after the surgery, they give us the bad news. And at that moment, our family switched into, you know what, we are going to try to cure this. We're going to try to get rid of the cancer. We're going to not going to do surgery because she was 80 years old, but we are going to try to, prolong her life and cure this disease. So at that point, she's receiving palliative care. And so for months and months, it was almost a year, she received these types of treatments, lots of symptom management, some chemo and radiation, all of those things. But we had reached a tipping point where we started to look at the burdens of this approach, and it really outweighed the benefits, and it really outweighed, her quality of life was suffering. So at that point, that's when we moved to hospice care, and we stopped the chemo and radiation, but we're still doing all of those symptom management and that comfort care. So when I tell my own story about hospice, I have several, but about my own grandmother, people seem to understand the difference then when you present it in that kind of a way. So I invite you all to at least have a story that you can illustrate to families about the differences between these two, because I do think they can be confusing at times. Okay, let's look on the next slide about some of the common medical conditions that are associated with hospice. Now, we look at a number of medical situations, including accidents and illnesses, and even though cancer reportedly remains one of the most common hospice diagnoses, there are many other terminal conditions that can be referred to hospice, and those include the ones that you see on the slide there. So COPD, a person on COPD can eventually go on hospice, heart disease, strokes, liver disease, end-stage kidney, dementia. A lot of people with dementia and Alzheimer's go on hospice. And there really are no specific restrictions as to which conditions can be referred to as hospice. And it's basically any disease that's in that end stage and where that further treatment will be more of a burden or, it negatively impact the person's quality of life, and so that's when a person, becomes referred to hospice. Now, one of the greatest benefits that we can say about hospice is there's a team of people for support. So I want to look on the next slide. Let's look at this support team a little bit closer. Now, I want to start with the family caregiver because, of course, that's our topic today. That's our audience that we're really trying to help and serve here. They really are at the center of the hospice team, and they're the primary caregiver of the hospice team. Family caregivers typically provide for their loved one the bathing and some toileting, grooming, assistance with eating. They're the people that are there all the time, kind of around the clock, so to speak, unless the person's in a facility. Now, I think that that's an important message to send to families when I've been in the situation where families have said, where they're making decision, do I want to put her in a facility or do I want to keep her in the facility and bring her home to go on hospice and pass away, or do I want to, let her stay in the facility? And so that's, there's a question there. But I also ran into a situation with a family where their mother lived at home with them, with the daughter, and she didn't quite understand that hospice, the team wasn't going to be there every single day. They were going to be there a lot, and they were always going to be available, and there were so many other benefits, but in the end, she was going to be the primary caregiver. So it's just a really important distinction when we're talking to families about the hospice team. Of course, there's a physician on the hospice team. There's the ongoing role of the physician is to manage the patient's symptoms and pain. This involves a regular evaluation of comfort and, their modifying medication and any other symptoms. Nurses, another huge member of this team. They are the ones generally checking in and making sure the patient is comfortable and that all the physical needs are being met. They really also do a lot of educating of the family members. Might even be teaching techniques for personal care or giving medication or any kind of treatments that the person would need when the nurse isn't there or isn't available. Our social workers, another so important members of this team. You're going to hear me say that every time because every member of this team I feel like is so important. But those social workers, they're really providing us so much information. They're helping to coordinate community services. They might help coordinate additional home care. They might help with government benefits, meals, all kinds of things. That social worker is just the the one kind of coordinating all the different services. We also have a chaplain that's a member of the team. The chaplain is always available for spiritual support for the person on hospice. I've seen it a lot where families have their own personal, priest or minister or whoever, but the hospice chaplain is available as well. The team, the speech and physical therapists, they may or may not be on all hospice teams, but they are important to mention because they may need to still be a part of things if speech is an issue. Maybe they need to help with techniques to communicate. Maybe a physical therapist might be around to help the patient learn to move with a new disability or a new device. So a speech or a physical therapist could be part of the team as well. Hospice volunteers, they help by providing the patient with support and companionship. They're a very important part of the team, and they're an important part of the hospice benefits. So there's always volunteers available. And then there's that hospice aide, and that's like a home health aide. They're typically available on an intermittent basis, usually one time a week, usually for a bath or some kind of personal care in that realm. And then there also might be a role for a professional caregiver. These are those outside caregivers from in-home companies that might be able to help if the family has the person at home. And so that's just sort of a brief overview about the hospice team. But again, as we present hospice to families and this benefit to families, just thinking about all those members of that team that are there to help you, you can see a sense of relief come over a family when you tell them about this wonderful team that's assembled. Okay, I do want to look a little bit more about the professional caregiver and the role that they can play on the hospice team, and that's on the next slide. But basically, we've got to be cognizant that family caregivers, when they're the primary caregiver, can become overwhelmed. And even with the help of the bath aide and even with the help of volunteers, there still might be room for a professional caregiver. And, they can help with all kinds of everyday tasks as well, including personal care, but even the non-medical things such as meal prep and housekeeping and errands and anything to really sort of help relieve some stress from that family. I think one of the biggest things is that keeping a consistent caregiver coming in would be important to talk to families about. They can also be maybe that person that can relay information. When families are so worried to just leave the person's side, but with somebody there to say, here's what happened in the last 2 hours, just gives that family a little bit of sense of relief. And the other thing I think is when you talk to families about this option, especially the social workers out there, really make sure when they're choosing companies that the company does have specific training on hospice and palliative care. It's just important. This is a unique setting and needs a unique care plan, and so you want the caregivers to be trained in this kind of environment. Okay. It's important for our families really to understand what's going to happen to their loved one while they're on hospice and while they're entering their final journey here. So I want to start to talk about on the next slide some of those physical symptoms that we can prep families for that may or may not occur with their loved one. And so the physical changes that take place, it's really the body begins to shut down its regular functions. And the process of decline, it varies, and it can happen fast, it can happen gradually, and it really depends on the person's illness. Now, for example, congestive heart failure, which is what my other grandma had, it was an up and down. There were lots of peaks and valleys where, oh my gosh, it was time she was going to die, and then, oh, nope, she recovered and made a full recovery. COPD can be that way. Alzheimer's can be that way. So there's some illnesses where what families really want to know is how much time and how hard is this going to be. And it's very hard when you get diagnoses that have those peaks and valleys, but as much information that we can share with families about the journey is better. Now, things like walking and eating and breathing, they can become eventually difficult and become compromised. And you can see some of the symptoms of pain or physical symptoms on the slide, pain, loss of appetite or changes in appetite, shortness of breath, labored breathing, weaknesses, needing help with daily activities. So the longer it takes the disease to progress, the greater the physical changes can be, and that the adjustments need to be made by the family. So, and I think this is hard for families because the thing about hospice is you're in your end of life, you're in a pretty much a constant state of change. And so just for families to understand that and accept it is going to be very important. Now, appetite and food are a big part of this physical experience, and I want us to take a look at the next slide, and let's talk about some tips that we can share with families about diet and nutrition. I say this because I know you've all seen these caregivers that just want to try to get the person to eat as much food as possible to get their strength up, and their heart is in the right place, but it's okay if it's small, frequent meals, and it's okay if they're not eating as much. So we really need to advise families about diet and nutrition. It's a very important role in the final weeks, and it can provide some comfort and well-being for the person on hospice. So some of the tips that we can share with families are thinking about what are their favorite foods and thinking about planning those foods on a regular basis. My grandmother, who was 98 and just died a couple years ago, almost 2 years ago on hospice, her favorite thing was toast and jelly. She could eat it almost every meal, and she loved it so much. So sometimes that's all she would eat, but we know that she would eat that because she loved it, and secretly I think it was the jelly, but that sounded good to her on a regular basis, so she usually had toast at every single meal that she was served. Another thing to talk to families about is the portions, keeping them small. A person on hospice may have a limited appetite, and so when you put this huge portion on the plate, it can sour an appetite instantly. My other grandma who was on hospice, she loved those Marie Callender pot pies, and if you've ever seen those, they're huge. So we learned right away that we just put a little, like a quarter of that pot pie in a coffee mug. And she thought it was just the greatest thing, and that's how she ate it. And she would eat that maybe every other day, a little piece of that little pie. So got to get creative with keeping the portions small. We also need to think about serving beverages between meals, with meals, because liquids can sometimes make a person feel really full. So that's a great tip to share with families is don't always have to have 10, your coffee or water or your juice. Instead, maybe you just have one of those and then you try to serve the coffee after the meal, so to speak. The environment's important, and again, we can't force these people to eat when you're on hospice. They're going to have good days, they're going to have bad days. We got to watch some of those certain foods that can or cannot be tolerated. I think about those citrus foods. Those might be a little much to try, might cause some distress, so maybe, thinking about breads and cereals. Also, sitting upright during meals is a great idea and really helps promoting good digestion. As far as fluids go, clear soups, ginger ale, tea, things like that. For people that have difficulty swallowing, that's where this hospice team comes into play. They'll have recommendations. They might have a special thickener that can be used. And then it's really important that families understand that it's normal that the person loses their desire for food and fluids. The body knows what it needs, and it will begin to conserve the energy it spends on eating. So just so we've got some of those tips in our back pocket when we're talking to families. Okay, let's look at another physical symptom, and that's pain on the next slide. We need to talk about pain awareness. And this is also a very, nobody likes to see their family member in pain, but we know they're most likely going to experience some pain. So it's important that families understand that. But we have to arm families with how to handle it and not get super panicky and distressed and upset, because when they start to panic and get upset, it makes the person on hospice even more agitated and even more upset as well. So we've got to help the family stay subjective and stay calm. And we also have to realize that when a person says they're in pain, it's a subjective thing. And so the family caregiver has to be sensitive to when they hear those comments and not think, oh, they're fine. That wouldn't hurt. I don't think that would hurt me, so why is it hurting them? They really have to think about this in a different manner now. And I think the best thing that we can do, again, is to encourage a family to talk to the hospice company if the pain is occurring that's different or more unusual or more intense. And I talk about journals a lot and note-taking. This is where we want families to probably keep track of those things and keep track of, what type of pain is it? Is it throbbing? Is it dull? Is it deep? Is it close to the surface, et cetera, et cetera. And then as the family, the hospice company usually is going to ask, let's talk about the intensity of the pain using the scale of 0 to 10. So we've got to get families familiar with that scale. And then as they're, trying to navigate some of this pain management before, panicking and calling up the hospice company, there's other things that they can do, such as, a gentle massage or heat or cold therapy, or even putting some music on, some visualization, some breathing exercises. So it's always good to try to, work through some of these things. But again, that's a very tough balancing act. And I think the families probably call a little more often in the beginning until they kind of get used to some different things. But keeping that journal really can help families see, oh, the pain is different today. Or no, this wasn't just a fluke, or this is just a, So I really would encourage that that journaling, or even just a notepad, taking a few notes. Journaling's a little bit different. So then let's look at the next slide and talk about the emotional toll and some of the needs of a person on hospice. When someone's faced with death, it can arouse a wide range of emotions, and people react differently. And some instances may be the stage of life they're in. It could be their personality. It could be their religious beliefs. Whatever it is, people react differently. And we need to help family members understand that everyone is an individual and they need to be able to deal with death in their own way. So we can't force the person on hospice to deal with it the way we would deal with it, for example. Now, people who are dying should be given the opportunity to express themselves and express it and not be worried about judgment. And we really need to encourage those supportive relationships that allow for open communication to give that dying person the freedom to express everything from fear to anger to frustration to sadness to joy, all of those things. So let's look at the next slide to see how families can support their loved one when they are going through some of these emotional experiences. I think one of the biggest things is to be honest. We always have to be upfront and encourage the truth. And I know that's hard. It is such a hard thing. But we need to avoid those cliches such as, oh, everything's going to work out, or you'll be back to your old self in no time. So we've just got to advise families to, and even not even just our families can advise friends and neighbors and people that stop over about these things as well. Now, on the last slide, we talked about some of the questions, and it's really important for us to encourage families to respond to opportunities to talk about death. This happens, and when a family does not acknowledge death, it could suggest that it's too terrible to talk about. So again, we've got to make sure we're having that open, supportive relationship between the family and the person on hospice. Now, we need to tell families that rather than avoiding questions or giving untrue answers, that maybe we acknowledge that the question's a really good question and it's really important, and let's talk to professionals. So I've had a person ask me before, is this illness terminal? And, just a simple response is, it sounds like you're very concerned about the illness. Let's talk with the doctor who will be able to answer the medical questions. Or let's write down those and talk to the doctor on the next visit. So if a person's not comfortable saying, yes, it's a terminal illness, the hospice team is there for support. We also have to encourage families to be non-judgmental. Again, everybody deals with things differently, and it really depends on the person's past and their personal beliefs. We don't want to argue, and I know that seems like super obvious, but we have to realize that a person may be in denial, and denial is a defense mechanism that enables that person on hospice to cope. So families have to learn not to take things personally, and they've got to figure out ways to alleviate some of that frustration and not argue. It's also okay to tell our family caregivers, that it's okay to allow for silence. It's, really match how the individual is being, match their behavior. They may be tired. They may not have anything to say. They may not want to talk at that point, and that's okay. Also, respecting a person's space is pretty big, and this is where I've talked about a few times how families, they're a little overbearing, or sometimes they can just be crowding and always there and always wanting to be around. And that's for some families or some people that are on hospice. They sometimes need some space. They need a different person around, or they just want to be alone, or maybe they just want to, think about things on their own. So we just have to think about that when we're talking to families, to be sensitive to that as well. Okay. I want to talk more about the communication and some of those phrases that we can help families learn or use when they're talking to somebody, their loved one who's on hospice. Let's look at those on the next slide. Now, we've just collected these throughout the year, and I think a lot of them are very helpful. And I think, I'm going to let you guys read those on the slide, or read them later when you get the email with the slides in it. But even some simple things as I'm sorry, or this must be hard, or I'm here for you, really promoting some of those, empathetic statements and, non-judgmental statements, not asking a bunch of questions, just really listening and responding in a very good manner. We can really help, we can share these with families to help them respond to their loved one's grief. And, a lot of you might find these useful to use. I know I found this useful. I did have my 98-year-old grandmother ask me, what is happening to me? Something's happening to me. Something feels different. And I said, well, instead of saying you're on hospice and you're dying, Grandma, I said, well, what do you think is happening? And she said, well, I don't think I'm getting any better, and so I think I might be close to death. And I said, well, I think you might be right, and I can't imagine how hard that is, and I'm so sorry. So I sort of turned it in so I didn't have to say to her, yes, you're dying. I let her tell me what she thought was happening, and then sort of confirmed in a way where I could give her some empathy as well. Now, another thing that we can do to help families and people on hospice ourselves, because I know a lot of you are faced with working with the patient too, is we can really validate their grief by sharing the stages of grief. And so I want to look at those on the next slide. I've had a lot of families tell me, I think I'm crazy, I'm going crazy, or I can't do this. And Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she's the psychiatrist who authored more than 20 books, and she's the one who came up with these stages of grief. And I really think that they help families understand that there is generally 5 stages, not always, but there can be these stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And when you talk about these stages with family, it's just giving them another awareness. It's giving them another way to say it's okay that you're feeling this way. And the other thing is that when families have said, I feel like I'm crazy, it's maybe sometimes they're overlapping, like they go to acceptance, but then all of a sudden they're mad again. And so Dr. Kubler-Ross said that can happen. You can overlap. You can go back and forth, and not everyone has all these stages. So, again, a person's response, the family's response can change, but just knowing that there are stages of grief and that this is a kind of, quote, normal, then I think that really helps families let it go and be okay, like, okay, this is how I'm supposed to be feeling. And they're a little bit more accepting of themselves at this point. Spirituality is another key area of focus on hospice care. And so I want to look at spirituality on the next slide and really talk about, and I had to do this, I had to understand a little bit about the differences between what is spirituality versus religion versus faith. And you can see that, spirituality helps people deal with the unknown elements of life. And it also helps individuals develop inner strength that can be used in times of trouble. Each person's spirituality is very unique. And it can be achieved, spiritual wellness can be achieved by a person's values and their belief systems. And so then when we talk about religion, this is really used to describe an organized collection of beliefs, cultural systems, or worldviews that relate to humanity. And spirituality is not necessarily religion, as someone may belong to a religion but is not spiritual. So I know this is, sometimes I have to reread these several times and rethink about this because it can be confusing. But I think the point of us discussing this today is to really show that when we're talking to a person, they could be very spiritual, they could be religious and not spiritual. It goes to the point that everybody's an individual and we have to understand what's going to meet their spiritual or religious needs during their end of life. Now, faith is just that confidence or trust in a person, a thing, doctrines, teachings of a religion or of different views. And so, again, just the differences between all three so we understand. And I got to tell you, I've heard a hospice chaplain once say that whatever brings you joy in life can be a spiritual experience. So some people, it might be sitting outside. It could be listening to music. And those types of activities can bring them the same peace as attending a church for a certain religion or reading a Bible for a certain religion. So, again, the key is that we really understand how the individual feels and what they're looking for when it comes to end of life. I mean, I know I've been in the room where families are fighting over taking mom to church versus letting her decide where she's at with her spiritual journey. So it's a very sensitive topic. So just having this information can help you all advise the family about spiritual needs. Now, there is a great exercise that I tell families to use a lot when their loved one is dying, and I think it could be considered a spiritual exercise. And let's look at that on the next slide. And it's a life review or a life legacy type of activity where a family caregiver could initiate some of these conversations. And there's some basic questions that the person on hospice may need to get answered, may want to discuss, and it can offer some peace during this process. So I've put a few examples on the slide there, and you can Google and get all kinds of information and questions about life legacy or life review, and all kinds of different things about this process. But the information really can help a person sort of reaffirm the meaning behind his or her life. Okay, and I did a paper once that talked about that if people can reconcile the differences or the hard times or the bad things that have happened in their life, and they get to a conclusion that they've had a meaningful life, then the dying process is more peaceful. So lots of research around this topic. I did a whole paper on this topic. That was fascinating. So this is a really great activity to do with somebody that's on hospice. Okay. Another thing that can come up during this hospice journey is a process called relationship completion. And I want to talk more about that on the next slide. The most important thing in our life is our relationships with those that we love. And Dr. Ira Byock wrote a book about the 4 things that matter most. That's what it's called. And don't worry about writing that down. It's on the resource slide. But there's 4 things or 5 things that a person must do before saying goodbye to their loved ones. And this is, you can see them on the slide. They need to ask for forgiveness. They need to offer forgiveness. This maybe include forgiving themselves. They need to offer a heartfelt thanks, offer sentiments of love, and then saying goodbye. And collectively, he called this relationship completion. And even if these are expressed in a letter or a card, it can be an important part of the dying process. And let me just tell you, this is important for our families to know and be prepared for this conversation. I had a very good friend of mine, a colleague, who was not very close with her father for lots of different reasons. A divorce in the family is one. And he was dying and on hospice. And I'll never forget this. It was a Friday afternoon, and she said, I'm going to go see my dad this weekend, and he probably only has a few weeks left. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry about this. Anyway, I said, how are you feeling, and how are you going to handle this situation? And she said, oh, I'm just going to sit there and visit with him. And I said, well, you need to be prepared for what we call relationship completion. And she's like, what the heck is that? And I told her exactly what I just told all of you. And she's like, oh, he'll never do that. We're not that close, Molly. We're not that close. You know, he's not thinking about that at all. And I will never forget on a Sunday on her drive home, because he lived a little ways out, she calls me on the way home bawling hysterically because this exact conversation happened where all these things went through this conversation. And she said, I am so glad you told me about this because I would have never been prepared to handle it. And she was crying to me on the phone, but she did not cry during the conversation because she was prepared for it. And she said it was the most beautiful conversation one of the most beautiful conversations she's ever had in her life. So I encourage you to really, not scare families or not, tell them, oh, this is going to happen, but just in case, just get them to be thinking about, is there anything that needs to be said? How are you feeling? Do they need to say anything? And just be prepared for some of these tough conversations. Okay, let's go on to the next slide and talk about the final hours. This is really one of those tough moments for families, and you probably get asked a lot about this. And so when we look at what happens in those final hours, even, the final day, there's a lot of changes that happen. And again, they can happen fast, they can happen slow. It depends on the person. And so breathing is one of the biggest change. They may be fast one moment, slow the next. They may be not at all. They may be maybe 15, 20 seconds between breaths. There's lots of different things that can be happening when it comes to breathing. There's also that accumulation of saliva and mucus in the throat, and that breathing starts to sound as though the person's gargling, and we refer to that as the death rattle. It's sort of a rattling or fluttering, and so preparing families for that sign. A person's eyes may be glassy. They may be tearing a little bit. They may be half open. The skin develops a distinctive purplish, reddish, bluish kind of pattern because of the reduced blood circulation. This is called mottling. I know you all know that, but again, when we talk to families, these are the important signs to share. And then the pulse is going to be very weak and hard to find. We should also prepare families for that surge of energy. Sometimes there's just this surge where the person wakes up, they want to get out of bed, they want to talk to people, and it can be just a very, very special time and for everyone that's around. But again, it's going to be a short-lived time, and the energy is not going to last long. There's also signs the person who is dying may show the family as they near death. And these signs have kind of been documented many times in hospice literature, and they're fairly common but not definite in every dying experience. And hospice nurses Maggie Callahan and Patricia Kelly, they've worked for about, I don't know how many years, but they've worked with about 2,000 families, and they coined these signs as nearing death awareness or near-death awareness. And it's really where a person can't explain it in common terms, but Families sometimes call it delusions, but they seem to, these two nurses, they call it near-death awareness, and it really shows that death is approaching soon. This is some of the signs that they talk about are the person on hospice may talk about somebody who's died, or they might start smiling or reaching for something or someone, or they may have dreams about people that have or events that have happened in the past. And so families should pay close attention to this and to the words, because that can be another sign. Now, again, I have that book on the book and those two nurses' names on the resource slide, so don't worry about writing that one down either. But again, it's just important for families to understand some of these signs, and so that they're prepared and know what to expect in these final hours. Okay, let's get on to the next slide and look at self-care for these families, because again, we've talked about how they, rarely want to leave the person's side, and so we really have to just talk to families about being very intentional about taking care of themselves. And we're getting lower on time, but I just want you to see these that, accepting feelings, avoiding judging yourself. I think that's a big one. Really not trying to bury emotions, joining a support group, talking to friends, celebrating small victories, letting feelings out. There's so many things that we can encourage our families to do, but during this time, it's so important for them to be taking good care of themselves as well. Now, a final topic before we get to resources that I want to talk to, and it may seem like a weird transition, but there really is opportunity to discuss with families about their own wishes when their time comes, so to speak. And so it's sort of hospice when a loved one's on hospice. It's a natural opportunity to bring up with a family. Do you have your affairs in order? Do you have your advance directives? Does your family know your wishes? And I think this is one of those hot topics that's out in the industry now. Even I heard a story on NPR a couple weeks ago about a hospital that upon intake, they make sure all that, they have these conversations about advance directives and does your family know your wishes and so on and so forth. So I want to look at the next and final slide about conversation triggers, and basically what these are just different ways when you're talking to a family, or the family, maybe they want to talk, maybe you hit a nerve, or you talk to a family and they say, you know what, you're right, I do need to get my affairs in order after going through this with mom or dad. And so helping a family find the right time to talk to their family about their wishes, these are just some of those different triggers that can come up. Obviously, a funeral is an obvious one, but different TV shows, family occasions. There's just ways that families need to start talking about advance directives and about their wishes and what do they want when they're dying. It's so, so important. I know all of you know that. So I was just trying to look for ways to really help our family caregivers get comfortable talking to their own families about their wishes and what they want. And so considering some of these triggers would be very helpful and be helpful to share with families. Okay, let's look at resources on the last slide before we open up for questions. And basically, you can see there's lots of hospice resources on caregiverstress.com. I put the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association's web address up there, and then our United States version, the NHPCO. We've also put on the Hospice Foundation of America. That's another great site with lots of resources. And then I did put one of those nurses' books up there called Final Gifts. And then I put Dr. Ira Byock's book, The 4 Things That Matter Most. I should have put more about the life legacy, and I might add that to the notes before we send those out to you guys. But those are pretty easily found, the life legacy questions that you can talk to people about. So, and encourage families to use with families. So I want to thank you all again for your time today. Thank you for coming on this webinar and learning these important about this important topic. I know you all know a lot about it. Hopefully you've learned a couple things today that you can help families better cope with hospice and palliative care. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Steve and open up for questions.
All right. Thanks a lot, Molly. Great presentation, as always.
Thanks, Steve.
All right. As you can see from the slide up on your screen, it's time for the Q&A portion of the webinar. So text in those questions for Molly, and we will get to them. First question here, Molly. Who is eligible for respite care, and does Medicare pay for it?
You know, that is a great question, and yes, there is a respite benefit. When we talk about eligibility, and I don't have it in front of me. Gosh, this is a great question. I should have gotten this out. There is a person on hospice can qualify for respite, but there is a certain, like you get so many hours every certification period. And I just don't have that right off of the top of my head. I can try to look for that, and we can send that back out when we send the slides. But that's a great question. There is respite available, some respite services. So, but I do know that there is some eligibility. Every time that the person's recertified, there's a certain number of hours or certain number of dollars that are allocated for respite care. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific than that.
Okay, next question. Is there a hospice mission or Bill of Rights or something that outlines the mandates and goals of hospice across all programs nationally?
Yes, and I think we can find those on the Canadian Hospice or the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization. And I think what you'll find is, yeah, there's sort of a set, I don't know if it's called Bill of Rights. It might be called like a set of standards. I can't remember the exact name of it. And it's really just a set of guidelines and a set of, this is what hospice means and the different, not the differences, but this is what hospice means and this is what you should get on a hospice program. Yes, that is available. And I would go right to one of those, like I'd go to the NHPCO's website and look that up because it is definitely available.
Okay, and we had a couple people write in to say that 5 days of respite care is
there it is.
For each
Thank
episode.
you. Thank you out there.
Here's a really good question. Should a professional encourage a caregiver that hospice would be good for a client when the client is adamant that they don't want hospice care?
Will you read that one more time, Steve, the first part?
Sure. Should a professional encourage a caregiver that hospice will be good for a client when the client is adamant that they don't want hospice care?
So are we trying to say the client doesn't want it, so we're trying to get the caregiver?
Yeah, it seems the way I'm reading is that the client is not interested in hospice care, but there's a professional on the scene who might think that might be appropriate, and they how to best encourage a caregiver.
Okay, I think that I've actually been in this situation before, and there is no right or wrong answer here, but basically what it takes is a lot of talking. And I think about it, I think when, again, somebody hears the word hospice and they think, oh, they're just going to speed up my death. This is what's going to happen. And I know as professionals out there, you've probably explained it several times already in a way that helps them not think that that's what it does. But I think this is where we really, as professionals, I know I have to do this so often, think of new ways of explaining things or think of new angles, new information that I can share with families to sort of, and this patient on how to ease their mind about it. And a lot of it could be what is their biggest objective or why don't they want hospice? And if it's they want a cure, they want to keep getting cured, that's where we need to rely back on our doctors. And maybe I've seen it where we've had several different doctors, and gotten second opinions and third opinions where it said, yes, your illness is terminal, I'm very sorry. So I think there's a a couple ways to look at it is either, trying to understand why, and if you've done that, really, is it if the doctor needs to get involved to give more information, if you need to think of a new angle to use. If the person's going to die and would benefit from hospice, then I know you'd want them to be on that. The other thing we have to consider is that it is a choice, and they don't need to be on hospice, and that it's a benefit. So there comes a point where we have to step aside and let it go. And I know all of you know that moment when you've exhausted it. Either you've had other family members talk to the person, maybe I've seen chaplains come in and talk to the person, and when you've exhausted your resources, it's just time to let it go, and there's nothing more that you can do. So I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. I just find that when you're explaining tough things like this, you're probably going to have to try several times and several different angles and several different ways to get the point across. But again, there's a fine line of be careful not to go too hard, too overboard, because the person does have a choice in the end.
Okay. If a patient receives hospice services in a facility, are the services the same as received at home?
Let's see. I'm trying to figure out what the. Yes. The difference is that in the facility, you're still going to pay for the bed, and the nursing staff, there's going to be staff there to do all the personal care and transferring and all of those type of things. But basically, at home, a family caregiver or caregivers or neighbors or whoever are doing it. But it's the same types of benefits, yes, and it's the same program. It's the same. If they're in a facility, they'll have a medical director or their own doctor who still sees them, but then they'll also have that hospice physician, for example. They'll still maybe have somebody in the facility give a bath, but then they would have an option to use a bath aid from the hospice company, so to speak. So, yeah, it's the same benefits. It's just a different setting, if that makes sense.
Okay, what happens if the prospective hospice patient has no family or is not able to make decisions?
Well, I think that's a question that we probably get faced a lot. It doesn't matter if they're on hospice or what. What do we usually do when somebody doesn't have family or neighbors or anybody that can make decisions? So I know that there's a legal process there. I know that there's ombudsmen available that can help people. That's the first place I usually turned in that scenario when I was in the facility world is, that's where I saw it the most, is where we would have to call an ombudsman from our state and get some help and get some advice and go from there and make decisions and see if, they have some ways and some services that they can look and see, do some extra searching, so to speak, for additional family members if there are any like long-lost family members, for example. So I think the protocol would be the same as if, regardless if it's hospice or not. I usually would get the ombudsman program or the state involved or area office on aging and ask for help and a social worker to help with the care and the decisions.
Okay, well, Molly, we have just reached the end of our hour here, and we're out of time today, unfortunately. But I want to thank you for joining us again today and for a great webinar and a very important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you again all for joining today. Have a great summer. We'll see you next month.